All right, fifth grade, we are ready for page 299, and I have a whole bunch of stuff going on my board again today, so we're going to talk about each of the different sections, and then hopefully it'll make sense for you to work through the page. If you have questions, always feel free to contact me or ask a parent or whatever you need to do. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is equivalent decimals. Zeros are one of those things in decimals that come in handy for comparing decimals. And you can add zeros to the end of a number and it doesn't change its value. So 0.5, 0.50, 0.500, those are all equivalent, okay? Now, the only place you can add a zero and it still not change its value is to the end of the number. So I wrote this one up here to show you that is not equivalent. You cannot add a zero between the decimal and the number. You can only add zeros after the number and still keep the value the same. So the zero has to come after it to make it equivalent, and we're going to use that in a little bit, so I needed to explain that first. Okay, on the next section here, it talks about changing these numbers to hundredths. So when you're changing a decimal to hundredths, you need to know that a hundredths has two spots behind the decimal. Just like the word hundred has two zeros in the number 100, hundredths has two spots behind the decimal. So what I want is for all of the numbers in this section to only have two numbers behind the decimal. And this is where our zeros, being able to put them and drop them from the end, comes in very handy. So to change 7/10ths to 7/100ths, I can just simply add a zero to the end of the 7, okay? Now remember, I can't put it in front. That changes the value of the 7, and I don't want to do that. So I can add it behind the 7. So 0.3 would be the same way. 0.3 and add a zero behind it. Now 0.900 is going to go the opposite way. Just like I can add zeros to the end of the number and it doesn't change the value, I can also take them off. As long as they're not in the middle of two regular numbers, as long as it's on the end, I can drop it. So I can change this one to 0.90, okay? So zeros on the end of a decimal can be added or dropped off without changing the value of the number, okay? So there's that section. The next section is rounding, and I wrote one up here that's rounding to the hundredth spot and one that's rounding to the 10th spot, so I can show you both ways. When you're rounding to the hundredth spot, remember the hundredth spot is two places behind the decimal. So this 2 right here is in my hundredth spot, and it's very important that you know which spots are which, because when it says to round to the nearest hundredths, the number in the hundredth spot is the one I'm rounding. The numbers in front of it, unless it's a 9, then it changes some things. But as long as it's not a 9, the numbers in front of it are going to stay exactly the way they are. So the 7.3 is going to stay the same. The 2 is the number I'm rounding. The number behind it is going to tell me what to do. Just like regular rounding, if the number behind it is a 5 or more, I'm going to round up. If the number behind it is a 4 or less, I'm just going to drop that end number off and I'm going to leave that number I was rounding the same as it was. In this case, I have a 6 telling me what to do. 6 tells me I'm going to go up one number. So I'm going to change the 2 to a 3. So my rounded number is going to be 7.33. And remember, if it says hundredths, I need 2 spots behind my decimal. The next section tells you to round to the nearest 10th. The 10th spot is the first number behind the decimal. Okay, so that's the number I'm going to be rounding. It's either going to stay a 7 or it's going to become an 8. The number right behind it tells us what to do. It's a 6. 6 tells me I have to go up. So my answer is going to be 2.8 because my 7 is going to go up one number. Okay, so make sure you're looking at the right number in what place it is before you start rounding. All right, the last section I'm going to talk about is comparing decimals. Again, this is where the adding zeros and dropping zeros is super handy because I want to make sure in my decimal part that I have the same amount of numbers. This one has 1, this one has 2. Okay, so I want this one to have 2 so I can look at them with the same amount of numbers. So I'm just going to simply add a 0 behind the 1. Okay, now I'm going to compare them with equal numbers. So I have 27.10 and I have 27.1. So now I know that that's actually my bigger decimal number. So if you even out the number of numbers behind the decimal, then it's easier to tell which one is bigger. Now, if the front number, if this would have been 27 and 28, then obviously the 28 would have been bigger. So you can look at numbers, but if it has the same front number and the decimal numbers have different amount of numbers in them, then you can add zeros or take away zeros to make them have the same amount. Now, I can't take this 0 away because it has a 1 behind it. I can only drop and add zeros that are behind the regular numbers. You can't do them if they're in between a number and a decimal. Okay, so that's it for $2.99. You have one more video this week, and I will see you on that one shortly.